Today I'm going to tell you about how to decide whether using a free float exchange rate or a fixed exchange rate, which one is better. Now, fixing an exchange rate, remember, it requires the use of the central bank's FX reserves. And the second option that the central bank has is to play around with the country's interest rates. Those are the basic couple of ways in which the central bank tries to fix the exchange rate. Let me start with you. Does Pakistan's exchange rate, does it fluctuate? Come on, yeah, that is an easy question. Pakistan का exchange rate fixed है कि fluctuate करता है? It fluctuates. Are we always happy about it when our exchange rate fluctuates?
No.
We are not. हमारा exchange rate हर वक्त fluctuate करता है, and one of the biggest problems that creates, obviously महंगाई शंगाई होती है, but we have already been talking about it. Think about businesses. Think about businesses and the uncertainty they face. Think about all those businesses that have something to do with importing or exporting something. Maybe they are exporters of the final product. Most of the firms, they import their raw materials. They import a lot of other raw materials. I mean, actually, you capture everything. So even if you are importing raw materials, even if you are importing parts to make the product that is your final product, अगर तुम्हारा exchange rate ही unstable है, so for businesses it means a lot of uncertainty about what will be my cost of production, and therefore uncertainty about how our business is going to plan ahead, and therefore all of these problems ultimately mean कि तुम्हारे मुल्क में investment activity कम हो जाएगी. इन्वेस्टमेंट एक्टिविटी कम हो जाएगी, बिजनेसेस की ग्रोथ कम हो जाएगी, द इंटरेस्ट ऑफ एंटरप्रेन्योर्स इन सेटिंग अप बिजनेसेस इन योर कंट्री दैट विल डिक्रीज. Now, all of these explanations that I am giving you here over how uncertainty then leads to confusion, and difficulties in forward planning for businesses, and therefore ultimately investment कम होती है. Remember, that would be the analysis part, elaborating upon this simple point कि अगर free float exchange rate में पढ़ते हो, one disadvantage is that there will be uncertainty, your exchange rate will be unstable, and that is not good for businesses, that is not good for investment, and that is not good for encouraging the entrepreneurs to set up new businesses. So that is your easy point. 3 एक नंबर तुम इसी में से निकाल लोगे कि that is one disadvantage of using a free float exchange rate. Now, इसी से related, think about, I talked about speculation as one of the reasons why exchange rate may depreciate, or sometimes it can also appreciate because of speculation, but usually depreciation ही होती है speculation पे. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage of a free float exchange rate?
Disadvantage.
That is a disadvantage. So that is your second point. Free float exchange rate, you are always open to the risk of what we call speculatory attacks on your country's currency. Speculatory attacks. Now, one good current example of speculatory attack, I mean, I shouldn't say it's not just purely a speculatory attack, but you can see this happening with the Russian ruble, the Russian currency these days. जंग लग गई है, and all the Western countries are threatening that we will put sanctions. They have actually put sanctions, but their exchange rate, it has depreciated by almost 30 to 40%, and all of that fall in that Russian currency, all of that depreciation is not just because of fundamentals, it's not just because it should be there. उसमें से काफ़ी ज़्यादा ऐसा is just speculation. That look, if Western countries, perhaps they will keep on putting these sanctions, and therefore Russia's next year is not looking good in terms of their currency. So many people start speculating कि रशिया में गड़बड़ होने वाली है, रशिया की करेंसी गिरने वाली है. So everybody starts selling, और वो 10% depreciate होनी थी, it ends up depreciating by 30%. So that's a speculatory attack. Now, इसी एपिसोड पे अगर तुम रहो तो the Russian government, it announced कि ठीक है, अगर आपने हमारे बैंक रिजर्व्स वगैरह फ्रीज किए हैं and you are putting us under sanctions, then what they have told the European countries and all the other buyers of Russian gas being a Russian export, उन्होंने कहा हमने फिर डॉलर और यूरो में नहीं बेचनी अपनी गैस. If you are freezing our foreign currency reserves, central bank के assets freeze कर रहे हो, then Russians are saying that you have to pay us in rubles. Now, again, I mean, it would be very interesting to understand all of these things कि रशिया ने अगर कहा कि रूबल में ही हम गैस बेचेंगे तो how does that work? But basically what I want you to understand here is just the simple announcement that Russians have said कि अच्छा फिर हमें रूबल्स में हमारी गैस खरीदो हमारे से, that has just told the speculators कि अच्छा भाई now the ruble will recover. And अभी वो negotiations हो रही हैं whether it will be in rubles, whether this sale purchase of gas will be in euros, but just this announcement from the Russian government that you have to pay in rubles, that was enough for the Russian currency to recover. जितनी depreciate हुई थी वापस अपनी जगह पे आ गई है. Okay, so that is where again I would stress this कि ये speculation का point, it is easy to explain, it looks as if छोटा सा point है, but it is something that really seriously goes on every now and then for a lot of countries. So I mean, I can give you and I will give you a few other disadvantages of free float system, but इन्हीं से if you move on to the fixed exchange rate system, तो उसके you can say the advantages. So these were the disadvantages of a free float system, and these very disadvantages, they are not there when you have a fixed exchange rate system. There is stability instead of uncertainty. Everybody knows, all the businesses, anybody who is related to exporting or importing in your country would know that exchange rate is not going to change. It is what it is. So there is stability, and that stability leads to confidence of investor, it leads to confidence of consumers, and this lack of you can say uncertainty or this presence of stability then in turn is something that will allow you to attract investors and attract entrepreneurs to your country. And similarly, if you have a fixed exchange rate, there is zero risk of speculation. There is no risk of speculation. Actually, tell me, do you think that is true, what I have just said? There is no risk of speculation if you have a fixed exchange rate system. Is that true?
सर अगर रिजर्व से खत्म हो जाए तो फिक्स रहेगा ही नहीं, तो लोग ये भी देख सकते हैं कि अगर रिजर्व्स हैं या नहीं है, फिक्स करने के लिए भी इतनी पावर है या नहीं.
Good, very good. So this again doesn't mean I mean technically this is wrong, no risk of speculation, but in your exam essay questions you make this point. Instead of saying no risk of speculation, we can perhaps say little risk of speculation. That is, usually speculators will stay away कि ये इस मुल्क का सेंट्रल बैंक अपनी करेंसी फिक्स करता है. बट एज पार्ट ऑफ द एनालिसिस ऑफ दिस पॉइंट, टेल द एग्जामिनर दैट यू डू रियलाइज दैट लुक, ऑन पेपर वी आर सेइंग देयर इज लिटिल रिस्क, बट you need to have FX reserves to be credible against the speculatory attacks. And the idea is very simple. If your central bank is sitting without any reserves and it says that, look, I will defend my exchange rate, so don't speculate, speculators will ignore that central bank. कि आपके पास FX reserves ही नहीं है, so we can see that you have no way of preventing a decline in your currency. Okay, so again, simple point, there is lesser or little risk of speculation. Give the analysis कि आप स्पेकुलेशन रोक सकते हो कि नहीं, even in a fixed exchange rate system. It depends on whether you have FX reserves, the capacity to defend your exchange rate or not. So ये पहले, I mean, you already have, through these couple of very easy points, you already have a good start to this discussion of free float versus fixed exchange rate. अब मुझे बताओ, think about a problem with fixed exchange rate system. अभी तक तो बहुत अच्छा हो गया. There is no speculation, there is stability, so on paper every country should be fixing its exchange rate. Problems बताओ मुझे with the fixed exchange rate. So
opportunity cost.
Exactly, please start using these technical words. ये जिसने opportunity cost साथ लिखेगा उसको, I mean, he will get an extra mark. तुम सिर्फ general language use कर रहोगे, you will lose a mark. So as far as disadvantages of fixed exchange rate are concerned, remember the first biggest disadvantage, opportunity cost, and let me write it down over here. Opportunity cost, so OC for opportunity cost of keeping FX reserves. Now we can add it here as well कि एक तो opportunity cost होती है, plus all the countries central banks they don't always have enough FX reserves, but I would prefer that instead of mentioning it here, mention it when you talk about this risk of speculation that is lesser when you have a fixed exchange rate, but it still depends कि आपके पास FX reserves हैं भी कि नहीं. Good. So you have opportunity cost of keeping FX reserves. Anything else? What about your balance of payments? Think about it. Balance of payments के balance के लिए which is better, fixed or floating? Which system will ensure that floating? Will it ensure floating exchange rate? Will it always ensure a balanced balance of payment?
सर बैलेंस क्योंकि जैसे हमने वो पढ़ा था
Yes. J-curve
कभी
analysis.
कभी ऐसा हो सकता है कि हमारी जो करेंसी है उसको डिप्रिशिएट होना भी कभी कभी जरूरी हो सकता है.
Very good. So balance of payments में याद रखो this whole issue of current account trade deficits. Again and again I have been trying to teach you this thing starting from this point, that when there is a trade deficit which ultimately throws the whole current account into a deficit, then the first effect of this thing is that there is pressure on your exchange rate to depreciate. And this, remember, if you look at that video on the consequences of trade deficits, this pressure on exchange rate to depreciate, always remind yourselves, this is the self-corrective mechanism of the balance of payments that is trying to kick in. कि गिरने दो exchange rate, it will just get you rid of this root cause of the problem. तुम्हारा trade deficit ही ठीक हो जाएगा if you let your exchange rate fall. So that is where we say that, look, if you have a free floating exchange rate, then the moment your country goes into a trade deficit, automatically your exchange rate will be under pressure to depreciate, which can correct this trade deficit. So अगर तुम्हारा free floating exchange rate and central bank doesn't do anything, then exchange rate will fall, the trade deficit will resolve, and therefore we say one big advantage of a free floating exchange rate is that it sort of ensures a balanced balance of payment. Or you can say it ensures that your country will not go into a trade deficit. So that on paper is one big advantage of a free float system. But here again, do mention this thing that this is how usually things work. If you let your exchange rate depreciate, you will get rid of your trade deficits. But even here, you can have problems. You can have sort of extreme situations जहाँ आप ठीक है exchange rate गिराई जा रहे हो, but maybe foreigners, they are just boycotting your products, or maybe you just don't have the productive capacity कि अच्छा exchange rate तो गिरा दिया है, but that doesn't mean कि products भी जादू से बनने लग जाएंगे. So if you don't have the productive capacity, if you are at war and therefore the world, the other countries is putting sanctions on you, और ये मैं sanctions का बार बार इसीलिए बात कर रहा हूँ because it was not very important until a month ago, but अब पूरी दुनिया एक दूसरे पे sanctions लगा रही है. So when you go into your exams after a month, make sure you bring in the sanctions if you are talking about trade protection, if you are talking about all of these issues over here कि exchange rate गिराएंगे तो क्या हो जाएगा. आजकल के ज़माने में कुछ भी नहीं होगा because today in these days what the world is doing is हर एक ने एक दूसरे पे sanctions लगाई हुई हैं. So even a depreciating exchange rate in extreme conditions may not ensure that you can or you are getting rid of your trade deficits. Any other advantage of free float system? Again, compare the two. Look at the disadvantage of fixed exchange. What is that disadvantage? You have to keep FX reserves, so there is a big opportunity cost. Convert that into an advantage of a free float exchange rate. If you are in a free float exchange rate system, you have no need for FX reserves. You have no need for FX reserves.
अगर FX रिजर्व नहीं है तो मतलब हम दूसरे कामों में भी इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं, मतलब जो पैसा.
Exactly. So there is no need for FX reserves, and you can use that FX reserve instead of keeping billions of dollars just to ensure कि जब भी trade deficit होगा तो you'll defend your currency. Instead of doing that, you can use those billions of dollars. Give an example here on things like schools and education and health and infrastructure and technology and so on and so forth. Anything else that comes to your mind? किसी ने अभी तक कोई क्वेश्चन पूछना है तो मुझे बताओ, because the next thing I'm going to tell you is something which is more real, more serious, but it is slightly confusing and complicated to understand. So मैं इसलिए तुम्हें पहले simple points देना चाह रहा हूँ, and that is the reason I wanted you to say them out, because again remember, this is a topic, this can be an extremely interesting lengthy topic, we can go into a lot of detail, but what I want at this stage is तुम्हें अगर question आना है तो it would be very very direct, advantages versus disadvantages, should you go for free float or fixed exchange rate. So उसमें before I go into the real thing, I'm just saying you already have 1 2 3 things for fixed exchange rate, and you have 1 2 3 4 things for free float exchange rate, so you already have most of your answer. So these are the easy things. First of all, remember these things. Uske baad, think in terms of monetary policy. Take a couple of minutes, think in terms of monetary policy. The main tool of monetary policy, I told you, is interest rate. Then think about what the interest rate or change in interest rate means for your exchange rate. उधर से सोचो कोई reason or criteria that allows you.
Inflation.
What about it?
सर अगर हमने अपना ठीक करना है फिक्स वो हम करेंगे, उसके लिए हमें इंटरेस्ट रेट को चेंज करना पड़ेगा, और अगर वो चेंज करेंगे तो हमारी जो एग्रीगेट डिमांड है वो भी चेंज होगी, और उससे इन्फ्लेशन या
But if you are fixing your exchange rate using FX reserves, then
सर फिर तो नहीं होगी उससे इन्फ्लेशन.
फिर इन्फ्लेशन नहीं होगी. Again, you are sort of revolving around the right idea, but you missed it. फिर से सोचो, you are revolving around the right ideas. Anybody else you want to try? Monetary policy से क्या करते हो? What do you want to, or what do you try to achieve using monetary policy and playing around with your interest rates? What are you trying to do?
सर वो जो ट्रेड बिजनेस साइकिल्स होते हैं उनको कम करना.
All right. So domestically, when you use monetary policy and you play around with your interest rates to control your domestic economy, what you are trying to do is you are trying to control the country's aggregate demand, and therefore you are trying to manage the short run GDP output, employment, and the price levels in the economy. That is what you are doing when you are playing with your interest rates as a tool of your monetary policy. You are trying to control your domestic economy. Now let's assume you are on a fixed exchange rate. Fixed exchange rate of, let's say, $0.5 for a rupee. So this is again your external economy, कि तुम्हारा exchange rate क्या है, तुम्हारी balance of payment situation क्या है. This is your domestic economy. Now let's assume you are in a recession and you want to increase your GDP and you want to shift your aggregate demand to the right. What will you need to do with your monetary policy, your interest rate? बढ़ाना पड़ेगा कि कम करना पड़ेगा?
decrease करना पड़ेगा.
Interest rate, you will have to decrease your interest rate. So that is what you are trying to do domestically. What does a decrease in interest rate mean for your balance of payment and therefore your exchange rate? Balance of payments में hot money inflow or outflow?
Inflow.
हॉट मनी यहाँ पे गलत कर रही हो. देखो सारी इतनी अच्छा करते हैं. आउटफ्लो, हमारा इंटरेस्ट रेट कम हो गया है, सो इट इज़ लेस अट्रैक्टिव टू कीप योर मनी इन पाकिस्तान. सो पाकिस्तान से पैसा बाहर जाएगा. मारूफ, वॉज इट यू स्पीकिंग और हु वॉज इट?
Yes sir, मैं थी.
ये तुम्हें समझ आई है? वाई वर यू रॉन्ग? इंटरेस्ट रेट फॉल से हॉट मनी आउटफ्लो होगा. डिड यू जस्ट मेक अ मिस्टेक और आर यू कंफ्यूज अबाउट दैट?
No sir, गलती से हो
हाँ
गया.
ठीक है,
I have the
ठीक है, ठीक है, ओके गुड. चलो लेट मी जस्ट कम बैक टू द थिंग दैट वी आर ट्राइंग टू डेवलप. सो इंटरेस्ट रेट कम कर दिए तुमने बिकॉज यू वांट टू इंक्रीज द डोमेस्टिक जीडीपी. तुम इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ चाह रहे हो डोमेस्टिकली, यू आर ट्राइंग टू इंक्रीज द अमाउंट ऑफ एम्प्लॉयमेंट, बट लोअरिंग दिस इंटरेस्ट रेट ऑन द एक्सटर्नल फ्रंट मीन्स हॉट मनी. सो HM फॉर hot money outflows. Dollars will flow out, supply of your rupee will be created, and your exchange rate will come under pressure to depreciate. But you are in a fixed exchange rate regime. So what will you have to do now? Fix कैसे करोगे exchange rate को फिर? You have lowered your interest rate as an expansionary monetary policy. You achieve GDP growth domestically. But I'm saying a lower interest rate means on the external economic front, hot money outflows and pressure on your exchange rate to depreciate. I'm saying if you are in a fixed exchange rate regime, what can you do to prevent this exchange rate from depreciating?
सर FX जो reserves हैं वही last option है.
FX reserves is your last option. Now the idea, the reason why I gave you this entire story is that again you get stuck at the point where you get to these FX reserves. FX reserves फिर कितने? How many billions of dollars of FX reserves you have? Which ultimately tell us this as a problem of fixed exchange rates. If you are fixing your exchange rate, then forget about your domestic policy. You lose control over your monetary policy. Monetary policy, remember, is a strong tool with which you can control your aggregate demand and therefore the business cycles, the short-run GDP, the price levels of the economy. But we are saying that if you want this luxury, that in my country my exchange rate is fixed, I have stability, there is no reason why speculators should come and attack my country's currency. That all comes at a cost. आपको FX reserves रखने पड़ते हैं to directly maintain this, or if you try to play around with your interest rates, then you can't do that. तुम अपनी domestic monetary policy के वजह से और focusing on that domestic monetary policy, you just can't keep on changing your interest rates because that will then start fluctuating your exchange rate. And if you don't have enough FX reserves, you cannot have this luxury कि मैं domestically expansionary monetary policy लगा देता हूँ, so my domestic economy grows. You don't have this luxury. Why? Because then your exchange rate is fixed and you will start finding it more and more difficult to fix it. Interest rate गिरा देते हो तुम, hot money flows out, then you have to use FX reserves. The day you run out of FX reserves, and if you still want to fix your currency, क्या करना पड़ेगा? You will have to go for increase in interest rates. You will have to go for contractionary monetary policy. You will have to squeeze your domestic economy. So again, bringing us back to the same point. You go for fixed exchange rate. External front पे तुम stability ले आते हो. External front पे you achieve something positive, but then you have to lose something. Economics में याद रखो, it's a principle of economics. You gain something, you have to give up at something else. So you gain the stability of fixed exchange rates, you have to give up on your domestic monetary policy. It's not a tool for you anymore. So ये मैं तुम्हें कह रहा था, it's a slightly complicated logic, but this is really the sort of real theoretical explanation or weakness of fixed exchange rate. अगर पूरी बात समझ आती है तो brilliant. And I mean, I find it easier to explain when I am drawing this diagram. एक तरफ domestic economy आ जाती है, एक तरफ external आ जाती है. Use the same technique if you are trying to get across this point in your exam. But if you are finding it difficult, then the short way, the thing that you then must memorize is that if you have fixed exchange rate, then you lose control over your interest rate as a tool of domestic monetary policy. That is the short way of saying this entire thing. Whereas अगर तुम्हारे free floating exchange rate है, then you have total control over monetary policy for domestic reasons. Total control over, I shouldn't say total control, let me think of a better word. You can use monetary policy with focus on domestic economy. As far as fixed exchange rates are concerned, you can't use monetary policy domestically anymore. Does this make sense? अगर confused हो तो please let me know. I would expect some of you to get confused over this. मुझे बताओ, are you all okay? पूछ लो अगर कुछ पूछने तो.
Yes, sir.
चलो, Amna, I'm so happy you are back. At least I get one yes. अच्छा जी, अब इसी से related एक आखिरी point है on this comparison of free float and fixed exchange rate. So let me put a star over here. Don't get too worried if this sounds difficult, and if you can pick it up, you should be very happy. So this is the real problem. उसके अलावा जो ये dots में तुम देख रहे हो, these are the easy ones. They will also allow you to score marks. Now, related to this idea of having control over monetary policy or not having control over monetary policy, मुझे बताओ, which country, one having a free float exchange rate or one having a fixed exchange rate, which of these two exchange rate systems will have a greater incentive of trying to control inflation?
The one with the free floating exchange.
Why? Free floating, okay, think about it like this. Free floating exchange rate में inflation हो जाती है. What will happen?
क्योंकि आपने कहा कि हम मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी में हम इसमें इंटरेस्ट रेट को यूज कर सकते हैं टू कंट्रोल एज अ टूल ऑफ मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी. तो फिर मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी से हम अपनी एग्रीगेट डिमांड ही कंट्रोल करते हैं और एग्रीगेट डिमांड कंट्रोल करने से मतलब इन्फ्लेशन ठीक हो सकती है. जो डिमांड साइड डिमांड पुल इन्फ्लेशन है उसको कम कर सकते हैं.
Okay, then tell me one thing. Will there be a bigger incentive for a country with the free float exchange rate to control inflation? Or will there be a bigger incentive for a country with a fixed exchange rate to control inflation? तुमने जो मुझे बताया तुमने सही कहा कि you have a free float exchange rate, inflation होती है, you can control it using monetary policy. मैं तुम्हारे से एक फ़र्क चीज़ पूछा. I am saying, for which of these two countries will inflation be a bigger concern?
सर फ्री फ्लोट
क्यों, क्या होगा फ्री फ्लोट में इन्फ्लेशन हो जाएगी तो?
बिगर कंसर्न सर वो सोच नहीं सॉरी सर, जो फिक्स वाला है उसके लिए कंसर्न होगा.
Why?
जो फ्री फ्लोट वाले हैं वो सोच के बैठे हुए हैं कि हमें नहीं सॉरी
सोच लो, टेक योर टाइम.
सर फ्री फ्लोट जो वो कंसर्न होगा क्योंकि जो फिक्स वाले हैं वो सोच के बैठे हुए हैं कि हमने सिर्फ फोकस करना है अपनी एक्सटर्नल इकोनॉमी जो इकोनॉमी है उसके ऊपर. इंटरेस्ट रेट और जो डोमेस्टिक जो एग्रीगेट डिमांड है उससे
ओके, स्टॉप हियर,
कंसर्न नहीं.
स्टॉप हियर. तुम कह रहे हो, तुम सही कह रहे हो. फिक्स एक्सचेंज रेट वाले कहेंगे आर कंसर्न इज एक्सटर्नल इकोनॉमी, आर कंसर्न इज फिक्सिंग द एक्सचेंज रेट. नाउ टेल मी दिस थिंग. मैं ये एनालिसिस रेड में कर रहा हूँ. देयर इज इन्फ्लेशन in a country with a fixed exchange rate, so don't confuse it. मैं free float के नीचे लिख रहा हूँ, but there is inflation in a country with fixed exchange rate system. What impact will that inflation have on that country's balance of payment? किस चीज़ पे effect होगा inflation से?
सर जो ट्रेड होता है
ट्रेड, तो ट्रेड डेफिसिट होगा because foreigners will not buy your expensive exports, so you will run into a trade deficit. What will that trade deficit do then? सबसे पहला प्रेशर किस चीज़ पे डालता है ट्रेड डेफिसिट? एक्सचेंज रेट to depreciate. You have a fixed, you want a fixed exchange rate system, you should be very very concerned about inflation. वो सीधा तुम्हारे fixed exchange rate पे अटैक करेगी. You have to prevent this fixed exchange rate from depreciating. What you need to do? You need to use your FX reserves. So that is the reason why we say that, look, when countries have a fixed exchange rate system, they will be very, very concerned about controlling inflation. Because they know it कि अगर inflation होगी, there will be a trade deficit and the exchange rate that we are trying to fix, it will come under pressure. And we will have to use FX reserves to stop this. So FX reserves, क्योंकि इतने ज़्यादा होते नहीं हैं अक्सर मुल्कों के पास, what do? They come up with conservative policies that, look, stop this thing, prevent inflation so that we can continue to fix our exchange rate. Now think about a country with a free floating exchange rate. वहाँ पे inflation हो जाती है. A free floating exchange rate, there is inflation. What will inflation do? Again, it will put pressure or it will tend to create a trade deficit. What will that trade deficit do? It will put pressure on your country's exchange rate to depreciate. You have a free floating exchange rate, so your exchange rate will depreciate and that will get rid of the trade deficit. So you will be sort of, what is the word I should be using? You would be too relaxed, too unworried about inflation, especially the politicians. especially the politicians. देखो होता पता है क्या है? Let me give you the real thing to end this class over here. Politicians क्या करते हैं? When they are coming closer to elections, what they do is कहते हैं यार look, we want economic growth, we want GDP to expand, we want the economy to expand so people have employment and their incomes increase and the economy seems as if it is going fine and we'll get votes. उसके लिए वो करते क्या हैं? They will lower the interest rates, they will use expansionary monetary policy, they will use expansionary fiscal policy और उसके through temporarily they will be able to sort of push their aggregate demand to the right and show all of these good results to their electorate that look कितनी अच्छी हुकूमत है, हमने GDP भी बढ़ा दी है, employment भी बढ़ा दी है, incomes भी बढ़ा दी हैं, inflation हो रही है. That government would be least bothered about it कि भाई look, this is what will win me elections. Inflation हो रही है, don't worry. What is the issue with inflation? Trade deficit होगा, not an issue. We have a free floating exchange rate गिरेगा, खुद ही trade deficit ठीक हो जाएगा. So what really happens in these countries with free floating exchange rate is that you have elections 6 months from now. Your government will start printing more money, lowering the interest rate, it will start using expansionary monetary policy. जहाँ जाएंगे कहेंगे टैक्स कट्स दे दिए हैं, गवर्नमेंट ये प्रोजेक्ट बना रही है, गवर्नमेंट सड़क बना देगी, ब्रिज बना देगी, स्कूल बना देगी, एंड दे स्टार्ट ऑल ऑफ दो स्पेंडिंग्स. वी ऑल नो दैट हर इलाके में काम होना शुरू हो जाता है व्हेन यू गेट क्लोजर टू इलेक्शंस. नाउ दिस इज़ वे वी आर सेइंग उस गवर्नमेंट का कंसर्न इज 6 महीने में भी इतनी इन्फ्लेशन एकदम से आप ही नहीं जानी. सो डू दिस थिंग, इलेक्शन में वोट लो. इन्फ्लेशन इट इज़ अ प्रॉब्लम, फ्यूचर में आएगी तो देखी जाएगी. एंड देयर दे हैव दिस एज वेल दैट लुक इन्फ्लेशन आएगी तो इतना क्या हो जाएगा, ट्रेड डेफिसिट नॉट एन इशू, एक्सचेंज रेट गिरेगा, खुद ही सारा मसला हल हो जाएगा. एंड दिस इज़ वन ऑफ द रीजन्स वाई, एज आई टोल्ड यू अर्लियर इन वन ऑफ द क्लास, आई रिमेंबर मैंने तुम्हें बताया था कि इट्स पार्ट ऑफ द अमेरिकन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन दैट नो गवर्नमेंट कैन कम अप विद न्यू स्पेंडिंग प्रोजेक्ट्स इन द लास्ट ईयर ऑफ इट्स टेन्योर. वो एग्जैक्टली इसी चीज़ से बचना चाह रहे हैं कि इस वक्त ये एग्रीगेट डिमांड पागलों की तरह बढ़ाई जाएंगे टू शो टू पीपल दैट इकोनॉमी इज़ डूइंग वेल, बट यू विल हैव अ बर्स्ट ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन आफ्टर सम टाइम. सो आप उन पॉलिटिशियंस को इजाज़त ही नहीं देते. इन द लास्ट ईयर यू कांट डू ऑल ऑफ दीज थिंग्स. नाउ अगेन आई हैव डाइवर्टेड अ बिट हेयर फ्रॉम आवर मेन फोकस, बट ये जो पॉइंट द पॉइंट दैट आई एम ट्राइंग टू मेक ओवर हेयर, अगेन आई गेट इट दैट इट इज़ स्लाइटली कॉम्प्लिकेटेड एंड कन्फ्यूजिंग, बट रिमेंबर जो तुमने आखिर में चीज़ देनी है, द थिंग दैट आई एम शोइंग यू इन द रेड, व्हेन यू हैव फिक्स्ड एक्सचेंज रेट, you try to control inflation, you try to be prudent with your policies because you want to control the trade deficits ताकि तुम्हारे exchange rate पे pressure ना आए, so that you can keep it fixed. So let me write it as an advantage over here. In a fixed exchange rate system, you are more prudent, you are more careful. 1 minute है आखिरी, I will need to start another session. But whenever it cancels, I will start a new one. Please join. So you are forced to be more prudent and more careful about inflation. Whereas if you have a free floating exchange rate, then actually let me create some space and let me start a new class. We are out of time. We are out of time here. Achha ji, let me just repeat it where we left and let us just take it to the end. Let us conclude this thing. So fixed exchange rate, you have to be prudent and careful about controlling inflation, or you can say you have to be more conservative about your domestic policies. तो पागलों की तरह अपनी aggregate demand बढ़ा के सिर्फ economy नहीं grow करोगे, because that will create inflation, put pressure on your fixed exchange rate. So we say it's a good thing, it's an advantage that your governments, they will always care about inflation, and therefore they would always try not to be negligent. They would always try to be careful कि inflation होने ही नहीं देनी. Whereas if you have a free floating exchange rate, then you are careless about inflation. Why? because you know कि इन्फ्लेशन हो भी जाएगी, okay, it's the general population who will suffer, economy के लिए भी बुरी होती है, but all we are saying here is that look, as far as this domestic versus external economies link is concerned, if you have a free floating exchange rate, you can not care about inflation. And the reason is inflation से अगर trade deficit होता भी है, your exchange rate will fall. It is a self-correcting mechanism that will correct your country's trade deficits. So that is the comparison of free float versus fixed exchange rate. Let me get rid of this one as well so that you can clearly see the important things at the end. ये सारा जो है, that was just an explanation. Again, try to secure your marks, try to secure your answer by going for the easy points first of all. Free floating में easy advantages are, it ensures a balance of payments, there is no need for FX reserves. On the disadvantages side, there is uncertainty and there is always this risk of speculation. Fixed exchange rate में the easy points are that it creates stability, and therefore it encourages investment, it encourages entrepreneurs in your country, plus there is no or little risk of speculatory attacks on your currency. Disadvantage, biggest one, is that there is an opportunity cost. You don't always have a lot of reserves, and even if you do, you have a big opportunity cost. So ये आसान points हैं. उसके बाद move on to the main thing, that if you are fixing your exchange rate, then you can't use your monetary policy, you can't play around with your interest rates in order to try and control your domestic economy. So तुम्हारे हाथ से निकल जाती है monetary policy. Whereas in a free float system, you don't have to worry about interest rates and their effect on exchange rates. So interest rate therefore becomes only a tool with which you want to focus and control your domestic economy. However, this can be a disadvantage, because अगर आपको पता है कि exchange rate depreciate होकर trade deficit खुद ही ठीक हो जाने हैं, then you become careless about inflation. Whereas if you are fixing your exchange rate and you know कि अगर inflation हुई तो it becomes even more difficult to keep my exchange rate fixed. So therefore we say that long term, these governments, these countries with fixed exchange rate, they will be more concerned, they will be more focused to try and not let this problem of inflation raise its head. So that is all. Questions हो तो मुझे बताओ.